Friends, say a warm welcome to one and all. So here I would like Hegel. So what I intend to do in this short presentation is the very title itself suggests how to read Hegel. So personally, what I feel is when we look at thinkers like Kant, Hegel, or Marx, very prominent thinkers. Very prominent thinkers in the sense that if we want to step into the intellectual pathways of either the analytical tradition or the contemporary continental traditions, especially phenomenology, existentialism, post-Marxism, hermeneutics, structuralism, feminism, or anything of that sort, post-structuralism, postmodernism, of course, no doubt. So we need to travel by or go by the philosophies of Kant, Hegel, and Marx. That is why in the last session we have seen how Kant, he is standing at the critical juncture of many of these philosophies. And maybe the way in which analytical philosophy has developed and the way in which the continental philosophy has developed, especially in the 20th century, is significantly based on the question how they read Kant. So when analytical philosophers read Kant in terms of his critique of reason, the continental philosophers, they tried to read Kant in terms of his concept of consciousness, the question of freedom and all that. Similarly, I think it's very important how we read Hegel. But we are at our own choices, or we have got every freedom to read a philosopher or a philosophical system in whatever ways we feel, because I think that is the very beauty of philosophy. So here my question is how to read Hegel. Especially Hegel, we know, is a very complex philosopher, I shall say. Because the way in which he has tried to bring together under a single umbrella of what he calls the absolute or what he calls the gist, consists of a lot of things: reason, morality, religion, self, freedom, consciousness, state, art, politics, whatnot. So everything, maybe everything that is below the sun or above the sun, I can say. So everything he wanted to bring under one single umbrella of, I can say, this absolute or the concept of reality. Usually, people read Hegel as an idealist philosopher. And there is no doubt that Hegel represents one of the important thinkers of German idealism. That's true. But there are a lot of other significant elements in Hegel which are not perhaps highlighted by thinkers. Whenever we would like to place Hegel under the label of German idealism, so there are a lot of significant elements, I shall say, especially his questions relating to self-consciousness, not consciousness, but I say self-consciousness, freedom, and also master-slave dialectic, which though occasionally comes to the limelight or comes to the forefront, they are very significant, I shall say. And in this short presentation, I'll try to pay much attention or focus my presentation upon these particular aspects of Hegel. The question why, questions on self-consciousness or freedom or master-slave dialectic is See, these are some of the important philosophical contexts, I shall say, which we shall deal very seriously before entering into or before reading a Sartre or a Simone de Beauvoir or a Bishop, sorry, I mean a Judith Butler or Foucault or Lacan or any philosopher of that kind. So, in the last presentation, I was trying to bring out how Kant tried to address the question of freedom, self-consciousness, sorry, I mean consciousness, etc. And in this presentation, I'm trying to bring in that particular element also. What is exactly the connection that holds between Kant and Hegel, or to put it in more simple terms, I can say how Hegel saw Kant or how Hegel read Kant. So, how Hegel read Kant and how the post-Kantians or the post-Hegelians read Hegel. So, something like Hegel standing as if he's a bridge between the traditional philosophies and the contemporary 20th century philosophy. So with this brief introduction, let me move on to who Hegel is, preliminary or background concepts relating to Hegel. So Hegel was influenced by Kant, and Kant represents, we know, enlightenment. Then another important philosopher, Rousseau. So, how Hegel was influenced by Kant, and we'll be reading in the next two slides. And of course, Hegel was influenced very much by Rousseau. How he was influenced by Rousseau. See, when his questions relating to freedom, dependence on others. So Hegel speaks about, what is called reciprocity or mutual recognition, or mutual dependence of or I will say intersubjectivity. So this particular aspect, Hegel is getting much from Rousseau, because we know Kant is standing more or less on subjectivity, though he touches the question of intersubjectivity when he deals with morality. I don't think that is a very concrete assumption or a conception of intersubjectivity. Then, in fact, Hegel was influenced by Rousseau highly in his political philosophies, especially we know Hegel's general will. So, and the principle of the state and all that. So, in his political philosophy, we can say Hegel was again very much influenced by Rousseau. Then, Herder. So, Herder was a romantic thinker. So, Hegel was influenced by romantic philosophers also. So, Herder gave much importance to the culture of the common people. And we can see this particular element in Hegel, which may be perhaps absent in the philosophy of Kant. And Herder's concept of God as a transcendent being. But here we can say there is some point of difference between Herder and Hegel, because though Hegel, if we read from one particular angle, we can say that Hegel also believed in a God. But the question remains whether Hegel's conception of God was a transcendent, personal, theistic one, or it was an immanent, something like a Spinozian concept of God. I mean, an immanent principle. So anyway, the difference is there, but somehow or other, Herder's conception of God influenced Hegel to a great extent. Okay? So his Christian theology. So when we read from one particular angle, it is very evident that somehow or other, Hegel wanted to highlight the importance of Christianity as a religion. because at some point he mentions and he just wants to bring the supremacy of religion, especially Christianity and its teachings. But whether he was very akin to the institutionalized Christianity or not is a different question. For the time being, I'm not going into that. But it's that we can read all those things. So Hegel is doing something like a synthesis of enlightenment and anti-enlightenment, I can say. Or to put it in a different way, I mean, if we look at Hegel from one particular angle, we may feel that Hegel represents enlightenment. So we know what is the watchword of enlightenment. Sapere ode, or man, you dare to use your reason. Supremacy of reason over everything. So that is the very watchword of enlightenment. And so here in Hegelian philosophy also we can find the importance of reason as the be-all and the end-all of philosophy. And also, if we look at from another angle, we can see that Hegelian philosophy is a kind of anti-enlightenment. And this particular view, I think, mostly comes from thinkers like Rousseau and Herder, because they were a little bit skeptic of the very pronouncements of Enlightenment period. So I mean, the Enlightenment age, we can say, because they feared as if this reason may take the place of faith or religion. So like that. So, so if we look at from one angle, we may feel Hegelian philosophy becoming more and more religious or becoming more and more idealistic. So Hegel, though giving importance to reason, how we have to take the conception of Hegelian reason. So is he going something like an anti-essentialist philosopher, something like that? Okay. So that we can discuss later. So Hegel, we can say, is a finite, temporally conditioned human being with cognition. So temporally conditioned cognition means some sort of influence from Kant, I can say, and an eternal infinite being, where so he is free enough to extend his powers or his, yes, I can say the conditions or the powers of his cognition to any level. So how to read Hegel is very, very important. So there are philosophers who say that Hegel is a Pakka metaphysician. And of course, we also believe, because prima facie, we can say that Hegel is a metaphysical thinker only. But there are other people. See, that's why I have here given the idealists and the post-Kantians. During the contemporary times, there are even one or two analytical thinkers who say that one can find a good number of elements relating to analytical tradition. Especially his metaphysical speculations can be read as some kind of a descriptive metaphysics, which is related to thought and reality. So we know analytical tradition is that where one can find how thought, language, thought, and reality are being intertwined into one another. So Hegel was also trying to give a different version of that particular analytical tradition. So they can never see Hegel as a metaphysician or one who sees Hegel as a champion of the philosophy of history or philosophy of even freedom. Then again, that also looked at from another angle. One can never say that Hegel is a metaphysician. Maybe so. It is up to us, or it is up to the one who reads, or how one reads Hegel. So that makes the difference. So with this, again, with this brief introduction, I move on to the next slide. So first, let us see how Hegel moved from Kant. So we know Kant took the critique of reason and knowledge. That is, one of the fundamental contributions of Kant was to make the distinction between what he called phenomena and noumena, or unlike the other philosophers who, especially speculative metaphysicians who came before Kant, so who believed that man's reason can know anything and everything, there's no limit to human reason, etc. But Kant came and he said, it's not like that. If we are taking reason to the transcendental domains, then we may be falling into illusions and antinomies. Therefore, Kant set a limit to our reasoning. That is why it is called critique of reason and knowledge. So if our reason has a limit, of course, knowledge also has a limit. So knowledge can be limited only to phenomena. Okay. Now, the three stages of knowledge, the forms of sensibility, the categories of understanding, and the synthetic unity of apperceptions. Together, we can say they are the a priori conditions or the transcendental elements in Kant. They are the a priori conditions for knowledge. So they are the raw materials for knowledge, we can say. But the question is, it's the question which was mainly taken up by Hegel from Kant. Of course, Kant speaks about the conditions or the possibility of knowledge. So when I say these are such and such are the conditions or the such and such are the framework for knowledge, I'm giving simply a, I can say a structure or a purely formal structure. But what about the content? Okay, so that we are getting from the outside world. So Kant was always making some sort of divisions. And in Hegelian view, those divisions are unwanted. Why the division of knowledge into phenomena and noumena? Why again the division of disciplines into different things like that which is knowable and that which is which can be known only through faith, etc., etc. And Kant is also saying, mind maketh the nature out of the matter which is provided to it. So mind is there purely as a structure, isn't it? Because when Kant speaks about the transcendental conditions of knowledge, by transcendental he means, as I have told you in the other class, pure conditions for knowing, or pure forms of intuition, a priori forms of intuition, isn't it? And this particular mind is, yes, creating or it's making nature out of it. So this particular view of Kant, according to Hegel, is a paradox. It's a paradox in Kantian philosophy, according to Hegel. What is the paradox here? So the thing in itself has the basis of impressions. So, and that thing in itself is unknowable. Means what? For example, I can take, see, in the last form of knowledge, or the third form of knowledge, condition of knowledge we know is the synthetic unity of apperception, or the presence of that self-consciousness, which in fact unites or synthesizes the many forms, we can say, or percepts, concepts, etc. And one gets the feeling that the knowledge is mine. So for knowledge to take place, or in order that I have cognition, it is a presupposition or it's a must that there shall be a self, isn't it? Or there shall be that self-consciousness. But that self-consciousness is unknowable to me because it is beyond the realm of my knowledge. So Kant called such entities, we know. That is entities like self, God, etc. See, they are beyond in the realm of human knowledge. So that which is the very element or very condition for knowledge itself is unknowable. So this is a paradoxical situation according to Hegel. Now, Hegel's first step on Kant's epistemology is to bridge the gulf between mind and matter. So, why this kind of say the subject or the knowing subject and the object of knowledge? See, this particular aspect of Hegel is very, very important. I should say, because see, when we look at the Western epistemological tradition, in any epistemology, what is important is there are three elements. There is the subject of knowledge, there is the object of knowledge, and the knowing process. So there is always this particular division. But Hegel, he was trying to make a synthesis of many things, unlike Kant, where he was almost trying to, we can say, bring together logic and ontology, epistemology and metaphysics, as if they are identical. So Hegel wanted to bridge that gulf between mind and matter, or he never wanted to see such kind of a division like subject of knowledge, object of knowledge, etc., etc. Maybe it's my personal opinion. What happens to this epistemological tradition after Hegel? Let us think about that, or let us think over that, especially when it comes to existentialism, Heidegger. See, there, the important question is not how can I know a thing? Because the thing before me, for example, if there is a pen before me, for Heidegger, it is not how I know this pen, but for him, it may be the question of how it is related to me. So that is very important. And I think this particular statement of Hegel was a big turning point in the history of, or the historical evolution of Western tradition, I must say. Because with Kant, we can say, or the epistemological tradition, something like subject of knowledge and object of knowledge, it comes as if to an end during the, or with Kant, I can say. Okay, sorry. Next one. Yes, so Hegel here, in order to do that, again, see, these are all my view of reading Hegel. Of course, you can agree with me or you can disagree with me. So this is for, or it is for this purpose that I should say, Hegel brings in the concept of absolute, and it's the concept of reality. So it includes both mind and matter. And here I would like to say something more as preliminary on what in fact Hegel means by reason, and what he in fact he means by, we can say, absolute, what's the difference, etc., etc. So I think reason is the reality or the be all and end all for Hegel, I believe. So reality for Hegel is something like a complex entity, and absolute, I shall say, is something like an organic whole. So I repeat, reality is the whole, which he identifies with reason. It's a complexity, the whole complexity, and absolute is something like that organic whole. So reality or reason in its manifestations comes, or reality in its manifestations comes as if like a self-representation of reason, which we can find in epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, etc. I think it is in this way that we can put Hegelian philosophy. So reality in its manifestations So reality is real is rational and rational is real, we know. So reality manifests, and in its manifestation, reality is making or reason is making a self-representation of it. So everything is reason. Therefore, we can find reason in epistemology, the process of reasoning in ontology, the process of reason in metaphysics. So everywhere we can find reality or reason. That is why we can say that for Hegel, the reality is the complexity and reality is the organic whole. I will come to that later. So he speaks about something like the internal constitution of the structure of reason. Okay. But he also speaks about the objectivity of reason as a teleological process. And that teleological means with some purpose. So this reason is not static, first of all, I should say, because all of you know, for Hegel, this reality or reason is dynamic in its nature. It's always evolving. It's not a static concept. So that is in a process. It's not a product. It's never a product. The product means, of course, it has reached its final stage, but it's something is in process means it goes on and goes on. So reality is in its making. What is in its making? It is trying to know, it is trying to realize, it is trying to, again, represent itself, okay, with some end in view. And what is that end in view? Maybe absolute freedom. So I will come to that. Here Hegel says, reality includes both mind and matter, which can be very concretely put as one in many or many in one, or identity in difference or difference in identity. What is that? So it is something like concrete idealism. I think I can, of course, we all know these things, but still I will explain it or I will try to make it more clear. So idealism, of course, you know, where everything is dependent on mind or represented by mind. Plato also there is idealism, but Plato's idealism is objective idealism because ideas exist, but they exist in a different objective world. And when coming to Berkeley, we have subjective idealism, where subjective idealism means, of course, you know, it exists in my mind or your mind or in the mind of God, like that. But when we come to Hegel, it is neither subjective idealism nor objective idealism, but it is something like absolute idealism. So everything is an idea or just, and Hegel uses different terms for one and the same thing. Somewhere he calls spirit, somewhere he calls just, somewhere he calls reason, somewhere he calls idea. So everything is an idea. The whole is an idea, the absolute is an idea, but the idea consists of other ideas, and all those things are also ideas. So when I say something like this, maybe there is every chance to have a feeling as if the world that we see around is not real for Hegel or something like that. No, it's never like that. Because Hegel, he gives reality to this particular external world. So external world exists. Everything is real. This plant, animals, sand or stones, or the heavenly bodies. Everything has got an independent existence of its own. They're all real. But he would like to prefer, he would prefer to call it as an idea, or I would like to use the term reason. So the whole is a reason or idea, and the sand is an idea or reason. Plant is an idea or reason, animal is an idea or reason, heavenly body is an idea or reason. So everything is an idea or reason. And all these ideas or reason man is also an idea or reason. And all these things are, again, they are in the, something whole called the absolute idea. So what is happening here is something like one in many or many in one. Suppose I have a machine before me. It is something like a 3-in-1. One particular machine, I can use it as a photostat machine, and that person can use it as a scanner, and another one can take a printout from this. So three functions being done, or three things are separately there, isn't it? But the whole thing appears to be one. So in a similar way, fashion, we can say, everything has got an independent existence of its own. And what about my mind? It is again another idea. So what about your mind? Again another idea. What about other things? Again another idea. So idea, which is there in the whole. So this is something we can call as identity in difference, or difference in identity, one in many or many in one. That's why it's called concrete idealism. Because when we refer to Plato, it's absolute idealism, because ideas are the reality, but the abstract idealism for Plato, because those ideas are abstract entities. But here Hegel says, where do these ideas exist? It's not that we have to go beyond this world in search of ideas. Whatever we see around this, all these have got independent existence, but still they are all ideas. That's why he is using the term concrete idealism. Okay, so this concrete thought, here by concrete thought, I can say something like reason, or the thought, and that can be the key concept of Hegelian philosophy. And the dynamic nature of reality is the another key concept of Hegelian philosophy. And because of this dynamic nature, its manifestation, self-manifestation of reason, it is taking place through dialectical process. The dialectical process, of course, you know. So I move on to the next one. So the question is, there are different opinions on whether Hegel got this idea of dialectics from Kant, or what is that kind of a dialectical idea in Kant. So according to the view of Sterling, so different persons have tried to interpret Hegel. So one interpretation is like this. I have also included another interpretation. But before going into that, let me first of all say what's a dialectic. Because dialectic, of course, we can find in Socrates, we can find in Plato. Even in Indian tradition, there is a dialectical method. That is in Nanvik. Yes, it is fundamentally debate or discussion. And it is the opposition of conflicting views. So the three stages involved are, we know, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So everything after some time, because it is in the evolutionary stage, is in its dynamic nature, it tends to become its opposite. And in the third stage, it tries to something like a synthesis, or something like to reconcile between what is contained in the first two stages. So this process of thinking in Kant, according to Sterling, apprehension, judgment, and reasoning. So this thing appears in the case of sensibility, as far as transcendental aesthetic is concerned, and judgment in the case of understanding through the 12 concepts of logical categories, and the third one, reasoning, in the case of synthetic unity of apperception. So Sterling says this particular process, which Kant identified in the process of epistemology, is a kind of a dialectical process. So corresponding to sensibility, understanding, and apperception, of course, I told you. So in other words, thought passes through three moments: concept, judgment, reasoning. I have put here syllogism, because we know in logic we have corresponding to concept we have a term, and corresponding to judgment we have a proposition, and corresponding to argument, reasoning we have an argument. And this thing particularly exactly happens in the case of a Pakka logical Aristotelian syllogistic reasoning. So this is a dialectical method, Sterling observes. And then there is another view which says that in fact we can find the element of dialectics in Kant, which is a triadic way of articulating categories. What about the Kantian categories? We know Kant speaks about 12 categories, logical categories. When he speaks about the logical understanding. So the first set of categories they pertain to quantity, that is universal, particular, and singular. Then second set speaks about qualities, categories of quality, affirmative, negative, and infinite. So these two sets are something like thesis and antithesis. And when we come to the third set, that is relation or relationality, we can say. It speaks about something like inherence and subsistence in the case of categorical assertions. Something like a hypothetical one in cause-effect relationships. And the third one is very important, which is called community or reciprocity between the active and the passive. So here, see this particular interpretation of Hegel given by, Kant, Hegel given by David West, you can say, see, it's a kind of a sublative process where the thesis and the antithesis are reconciled. The first and the second sets of categories are reconciled very effectively. And I personally find that the category of community or reciprocity, which is emphasized by Kant, is a very key concept which Hegel took very cleverly and which he is applying in the context of the freedom of man, his social existence, etc. I will come to that very shortly. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you, if you want to read like that, of course you can read, because one can never ignore that or never say that there was no such thing like a dialectical process in Kant. Okay, so how Hegel took Kant's reason is important. So for Kant, reason, what was the role of reason? Simply in the, as if it's in the, it acts in the case of a mere understanding. That is, to put the percepts or whatever we get out of sensibility into, yes, its corresponding logical form. So that is the only role of reason, according to Kant. So Kant was giving as if a like kind of a formal structure. I already explained that. But Hegel, in fact, extended Kantian conception of reason. See, he did a synthesis of theoretical and practical reason. So that is again another important point which I wanted to drive home. In Kant, as I have already said, there are unwanted divisions like phenomena and noumena. Again, theoretical and practical reason. So Hegel says, why shall there be such a distinction like something is theoretical reason and something is practical reason? Hegel wants to see that synthesis of reason and only one thing, and that is reason. So according to Hegel, what about human beings? They are socially and historically determined forms of embodied human existence. So that sentence is very important, or that statement is very important. So we can find how Marxism evolved out of that, how existentialism evolved out of that. So that particular statement or observation of Hegel is very, very important, because what happened in the case of Kant, when speaks about especially morality, there are certain categorical imperatives, or there is something called a pure will in the mind of man, and he is obeying those wills. So when Kant says that, say, what about a human being? Maybe as if he is close or shut from his social existence, his relations with other people. So in nowhere this other is coming into appearance in Kant, we can say. The only place where I think the other comes or makes its presence in the philosophy of Kant is when he says, treat everyone, including yourself, always as an end and never as a means, of course. There is the question of the other, or there is some sort of intersubjectivity. But if we simply leave aside that, mostly Kant stands as if he is a philosopher who gives importance to subjectivity. Okay, so extending Kant's critique, so this is one of the questions which was put forward by later Kantians, or post-Kantians. So turning against the metaphysical aspects of Kant's philosophy, Hegel was taking as if a metacritic of reason. So that is what they say. So Hegel finds Kantian divisions as dehumanizing. Okay. See, along with reason, freedom, state, community, wholeness, all this we have to bring in, because we can just imagine or we can just see, if we are not looking at the critique of judgment of Kant, only we are looking at the epistemology and morality of Kant. Who is a human being? Human being is a purely rational being who is living as if he is with a transcendental ego. But nowhere that kind of a wholeness appears. Always there appears some kind of a division of personality or dividing personality, we can see. So questions of purely abstract rationality of Kant's moral philosophy was, in fact, it was taken by Hegel, and Hegel says how one's ethical life is determined. Unlike what Kant says, where one is simply following one's pure will or moral will, which is coming from inside. In our ethical life, we make choices. We consider an action as good or bad in terms of the culture or the culture milieu to which we belong, our relationships with other people or society. So all these are all very, very important, says Hegel. So he brings in what is called a kind of a concrete intersubjectivity here. And this is very important. So basic themes in Hegel. So he says, I'm going a little fast because it's not the very crux of my presentation. So, and I know all of you know or have a very clear idea about these things. So Hegel, in fact, says logic is equal to metaphysics, or real is rational. But what is Hegelian logic is something which we have to discuss. So logic begins with concepts devoid of content, that is being, this pure being. So Aristotle also, we know, he brings in these logical categories. But Aristotelian concept is a static one, because there we know there is this category of substance, then category of logic. All these things are only static concepts because they are purely rational concepts. But for Hegel, as we have seen now, it is only a dynamic concept. So because of its dynamicity, because it is changing or it is evolving, it passes into its opposite. So that is the very nature of any changing being, any evolving being. That is why Hegel says it is something like an organic whole and not a mechanic whole. That's the difference between an organic whole and a mechanical whole. Of course, an organic whole means this physical body of human being. We can say an organic whole, because every parts or the parts get its meaning only when if it is in the whole, and the whole derives its meaning only if it is in the part. But that's not the case with a mechanical whole, where the part and whole can have meaning even if they are existing differently, okay, or separately. But here that's not the case. That is why Hegel says, because this reason, here when I say logic, I mean reason. Here when I say metaphysics, again I mean the same reason. So it passes because it is in its evolutionary stage. Why it is in its evolutionary stage? Because it wants to fulfill some aim. It is teleological. It is purposive. It has an end in its view. And where is it? It's in our mind, in your mind. It is in outside the world. It's in nature. Again, it is in the absolute. And so which covers all these things. So it passes into its opposite, namely nothing. So it becomes its antithesis. And the two are sublated or synthesized into becoming. So when it comes to becoming, it's neither being nor nothing, isn't it? Something like a sublated position between the two. So it's the highest expression of metaphysics and thought. So with becoming, what will happen? It will act as the, thesis for the next triad. That is what Hegel says. Again, it's antithesis. Again, it's synthesis. Again, that triad stops and the next triad begins then and then. So you can ask me a question, then is there no end to this particular dialectical process, or whether there is no end to this triadical evolution? Yes, there is an end. And we will come to that. Of course, that is the absolute knowledge, or the realization of that absolute spirit, or absolute idea, or absolute knowing, or absolute thought process, whatever ways we can put it. And that is the teleology, or that is the, and I think I can put it in a very single word: freedom. Because that is the word which Hegel prefers to use. Freedom is the teleology, or the purpose towards which this reason is evolving or moving through triads and triads and triads. Okay, so history of this development we can take. So the idea must be studied. So here, idea or reason or spirit, whatever terms we use, logic or metaphysics, which Hegel would like to call in itself. See, just observe these terminologies, because again we can find these terminologies especially in existentialism, Sartre, Heidegger, etc. Out of itself, that is philosophy of nature. Then in and for itself, philosophy of mind. So these three become very, very important in Hegelian metaphysics. I'm coming to that in the coming slides. Another very important question of or theme of Hegel is freedom. So Hegel is a champion of philosophy of history, because the whole humanity, or the civilization, or the human history is evolving, and it is in a dialectical progression of structures of human consciousness. It's very important. You know how far or how much Marx was influenced by this particular statement of Hegel. So it's the progress of freedom, says Hegel. But what is this concept of freedom? So that we have to think, or that we have to see. Is it the concept of freedom which the Enlightenment thinkers, they really dreamed of, or it is something? Is it something different? So through dialectic, the concrete community becomes increasingly rational and self-conscious. Okay. So because it is progressing, or it is moving ahead. Now the question is this historical progress, or this dyadic evolution, this triadic evolution, is it linear? Okay, going as if it's in a straight line, very clearly. No, Hegel says no. Because the process of modernization or progress is a very significant statement of Hegel. It's not linear, it's uneven, conflict-ridden, series, improving manifestation of spirit. So it's not that our civilization, or what we call modernity, the process of modernization, is not a very slow and steady and a very smooth process of evolution or progress, but it's conflict-ridden. Why it is conflict-ridden? Why it is not linear? Because we know in every stage, every thesis, there is to every thesis there is an antithesis. But that is the important aspect in Hegel, because Hegel, there's a very famous statement of Hegel: every negation is a new determination. Whenever I negate something, that means what? It's the beginning of something new. Yes. So Hegel sees this kind of logically and teleological necessitated course of history. So the whole of history is evolving. The state is evolving, the religion is evolving, everything is evolving, humanity is evolving. Outside also, nature is also evolving. Inside, what about me? I'm also evolving. So everywhere there is this evolutionary process, because everything is an idea. Okay, so and the whole is also evolving, because you just think about one in many or many in one. Okay, so I move on to the next one. So it brings us to the very important question of consciousness and self-consciousness. They're not one and the same thing, but very different. So consciousness evolves through a series of transformations. Then what about Kantian consciousness and Hegelian consciousness? There is a lot of difference, I shall say. For Kant, we can say consciousness is something like a transcendental ego. Why? Because what's the role of consciousness? In morality also and religion also, consciousness has a role. But when we stick on to the epistemological level, we can say that in cognition, consciousness is simply a form or a condition or of the possibility for knowledge, isn't it? For a perception that it is mine, the knowledge is mine. Only for that, consciousness acts. But it is aloof, standing aloof from the world, standing aloof from the others. Okay. But the question is, how can we be sure about a subject knowing external realities? So this is the question which was asked by Hegel when he read the perception of Kant. So an examination of consciousness is necessary. Otherwise, there may be every chance for a skepticism. So like each stage of history, each form of consciousness contains its contradiction. So empirical consciousness plus self-consciousness, reason plus morality plus religion. So Hegel brings in a lot of things. So there is the empirical consciousness, that is something like a form of sensibility where, see, at the first level, there's something like it's in itself. It's something like I try to be something like a pure logical being. Then this consciousness, this reason, it goes out. And of course, outside there is politics, law, etc. And again, there is morality, religion, philosophy, and Hegel gives utmost importance to philosophy. I'm not sure whether I have included that point in any of my slides, but I will say here Hegel makes it something like subjective spirit, objective spirit, and absolute spirit. What is that? Subjective spirit means that pure logical thinking. But objective spirit means, in some books it is said culture and religion, but in some other culture, art, etc. But I can find in some other textbooks or some other readings of Hegel, this objective spirit is explained as something relating to law, then politics, state, etc. Maybe that's more correct, I think. And what is absolute spirit? Is the highest realm, which is a synthesis of the subjective spirit and the objective spirit, which is the realm of culture, religion, and I think Hegel is bringing art also to that particular realm, because Hegel gives high importance to art, or a significant place to art in his philosophical scheme. And he places or contextualizes philosophy there, because absolute knowledge, he says, is philosophical knowledge. Because here we may feel, we can see the philosopher Hegel when we read the absolute spirit of Hegel, rather than a theological Hegel, theologian in Hegel, I shall say. Because absolute knowing means philosophical knowledge, whereon realizes freedom, which is the teleology. So what is the ultimate aim of human life? If we read in this particular angle, we can say that Hegel feels that getting or realizing absolute knowledge or philosophical knowledge and thereby attaining freedom is the be all and end all of life. So Hegel, as if we can say, but is there any difference between such a state of freedom and the so-called religious freedom? Of course, we have to again check, or we have to rethink about Hegel. Okay, so and I'm not going to take that question now, but I'm putting such questions now and then only for us to make more deliberations. Okay, so with yes, absolutely, I have put this slide. So on self-consciousness, one's recognition, so that is very important. So what's the difference between consciousness and self-consciousness? See, in consciousness, I am what I am. That is in itself. But always consciousness want to see that, or everyone wants to see that, yes, they are recognized by others, isn't it? And it wants to move outside. So that is very important. That is why I have told you that this communality, or yes, community, the category of community, which is explained by Kant, where he believes in something like a reciprocity or something like, so mutual recognition, something we can say. So that is very important. So see, here comes the other in Hegel. Why I say is, whenever we discuss post-structuralism or postmodernism or feminism, post-Marxism, Lacan, everywhere we can see the other making its way. So mutual recognition as a conscious, self-conscious subject. Okay. See, if I am in simply what I am, I can see. The consciousness always wants some kind of a recognition. That's what Hegel says, and that's a very key point or a very important aspect in Hegel. I think especially the French existentialists, they have taken this particular idea of Hegel. See, it is from these kind of deliberations of Hegel that a kind of a French existentialism is growing. Or these are something we can say something like an you can't say that these are pure idealistic, purely metaphysical concepts, because you can interpret it in another way, something like a pure existentialism, something like that. Okay. So subjective spirit or logic to objective spirit, patterns of social interaction and the cultural institutions, and the way to absolute spirit or knowledge, religion, philosophy, etc. So culmination of dialectics is philosophical knowledge, fully rational, self-conscious, highest realization of freedom. So a radicalization of Kant's idealism. So some people say that, so with this particular kind of absolute knowing and absolute idealism of Hegel, and everywhere we can see something like subjective idealism, objective idealism, and of course he will even name what we can say the social institutions, political institutions, law, etc., state machinery, everything as if it is in terms of spirit or idea. So it is, and everything is, of course, it starts from the subjective spirit or logic. So if we read in that particular angle, we can say he was even radicalizing to a more step what Kant has said in his idealism. Okay, so that is up to us to interpret. Okay, so I move on to the very important question. This is the highlight of my presentation. Master-slave dialectic, the development of self-consciousness. It's a very, very important concept, we know. So it is like some people say it's a Hegel-Smith. There's a historical context for this, the fight between the lordship and the bondage. And it also has got some kind of a prelude to the Marxian class struggle and all that. So two distinct self-conscious beings. Now, if you ask me, where is this self-conscious being? Because that question came to my mind. That is why I just wanted to say something more about that. Is it so that it is something like my ego and my alter ego? Okay, if you want, you can read like that. Because at one point of time, it felt so. But at some other point of time, when I was reading this master-slave dialectic, which is also having a lot of interpretations, because Kojeva's interpretation is highly famous, and this Kojeva was a Hegelian who was trying to give much popularity to or publicity to Hegelian philosophy. And even I think Sartre was much influenced by this Kojeva's lectures, and Lacan, these different people, Simone de Beauvoir, of course. So another way we can say something like between two people, one self-conscious person and another self-conscious person. And you can even extend it to a social circle, like something like between two classes that exist in our society. One self-conscious group and another, between one group and another group, I can say. But anyway, for the time being, I would I would like to purely take it something like a one self-conscious being and another self-conscious being, which are in me only. Okay, so the dynamics of mutual recognition. So something like thesis and antithesis, we can say. I'm coming to that. And when so one self-consciousness and another self-conscious, something like an alter ego means, which is something like or that the other acts comes as if like an enemy, we can say. It's not like the Levinasian other. No, never. Because the Levinasian other means always the subject, it is existing itself for the other, because it is being placed or projected, I shall say, in some kind of a Christianity background, okay, or a Christian background, I shall say, no problem. So every self-conscious being wants some kind of our consciousness always wants some kind of a mutual recognition. So in every person, we know, we can just imagine or think it in our own cases, we can see that there is my ego, and sometimes some kind of an alter ego even emerges, or we have got a self-conscious being, and maybe we project something else when we move out, or maybe in the looks of the other, as what Sartre said, or maybe as the alter ego when I look at a mirror, as what Lacan has said. So anyway, two self-conscious beings emerge, and they are as if they are enemies or antithetical to each other. Okay, so they try to give some kind of a mutual recognition and some kind of a fight, because the one self-consciousness finds that, of course, it wants the other because it needs recognition from that, but at the same time it feels that, why is this? Because it is antithetical to me, it's an enemy to me, it is unwanted to me. So that fight goes on, and there is something like a struggle to death, because when the fight gets more and more intensified, it goes something like to say struggle to death. So here, three stages of development are in fact happening. First one is the desire. The self-consciousness is directed to things other than itself. So self-conscious, in itself wants to go outside. It wants to move outside. Maybe it wants to relate it to nature. We can read it like anything. Then there appears the master-slave. Self-consciousness is directed to another that is unequal to itself. It can be another person. See, when Simone de Beauvoir read Master-Slave Dialectic, she could read that as if it is between man and woman, because here the master can be the man and the slave can be the woman. So when man and woman, the two self-conscious beings come together, maybe they feel that they want, of course, each other, because they want mutual recognition. At the same time, each person thinks that this is unwanted, or this is unequal to me, or this is unwanted to me. And what happens last? This universal self-conscious emerges, and self-conscious recognizes itself in another. So I will explain it through my coming slides. Okay. So how this particular evolution takes place. So here it is something like, again, a triadical process. So the two meet, realizes self-consciousness in another existence. So each can only be for itself. Can be for itself, it can be self-conscious. So each views the other as unessential, not an equivalent subject. So I think the point is clear, because each wants the other, because by nature consciousness always wants recognition from the other. But at the same time, every consciousness wants to see that it is enjoying freedom, or it is because when the other comes, when Sartre says it occupies it is in the fear that it may occupy its own space, freedom, etc., etc. So the other is an enemy to it. Okay, so not an equivalent subject. So the two manipulate the other for their needs. Okay, why the other one? I want the other because I want a recognition from the other. And suppose A and B. So A wants to see that I want B because I want to see that my ends are being fulfilled. If B also want to see that, okay, let me manipulate A for, yes, my own desires or ends. So a struggle to death begins. But it's avoided by, yes, but never struggle, death will occur, because then that will be the end of the story. Okay. So that will be the end of the history. So Hegel will never say so, and that's never happening, because this dialectical process of master slave relationship, or master slave dichotomy, it is occurring throughout history. And when we read the Phenomenology of Spirit, I think that's the work where Hegel is beautifully explaining this idea, where we can see that Hegel says the whole of Western historical evolution is the story of master-slave dialectic. You can find different stories of master-slave dialectic. So what happens at the end? Yes, there lies the very interesting factor. Okay, let me move on to the next one. So both A and B never wants to see that death occurs, of course. Then somehow or other, one sees as if, yes, let me subordinate to the other. Okay, so the slave wants to avoid the death, so it makes a decision that let me be subordinate. Let the other one let me assert and let me subordinate. Maybe that's why Simone de Beauvoir read it like man-woman relation. You can agree with me or disagree with me. Okay, so the master emerges, and he becomes powerful. So he becomes assertoric, and the slave is in fear. Okay, so what happens next? Let us see. So what happens then? So both are self-conscious, and of course they are, both of them want mutual recognition, though now they are yes, by agreement, because one has conceded or agreed to be a slave, or to be subordinate to the, or subservient to the other. So because both wants the other, because they want mutual recognition. But are they happy? No, no, no. Not happy. Not the slave. Master is happy. Not the slave is happy. Why? Not happy. Let us see. The master is dependent on slave. Why? Because the mediatory relation with nature. Because master is also a self-conscious being, so he wants the slave for its mutual recognition. Now, this idea, of course, I have not written in this particular slide, but Hegel beautifully puts it there. See, the master also wants to see that it gets recognition from the other. So who is before him? It's the slave. But at the same time, he feels, oh, shall I get recognition from this slave? So, but what shall I do? I don't have any other person. I have to be dependent on this slave for everything, even for recognition. Anyway, the slave is not equal to me, but no other option. So it always depends on the slave. Then what it will do, the master, because it's powerful. Okay, let me do one thing. Let me enjoy maximum, and let me just what shall I do? Exploit. I would like to use the term exploit by the products that this slave is working upon. So the master makes the slave work and work and work, because he wants to, the master wants to enjoy the products of that is being produced by the slave. But just to see or just understand that the master's relation with the slave is only for enjoyment, and he is not related to any other. So for recognition also, it's dependent on slave. For products also, it's dependence. See, in one of the textbooks I could read that Hegel is using an example of an apple pie, because the master, see, that is the beauty of it. The master, though it has now become a master, and it has a slave to do everything for it, it's not still happy. Why? Because something like an because it has no relationship with any other being in the outside world or anything like that. For everything, it has to depend on this slave. So that produces some kind of a frustration, and this master always wants to see, so how can I get the maximum benefit out of this slave? So if apple pie, let it be apple pie, let me enjoy more apple pie. Again, it will ask, say, okay, bring more. And the slave is working and working and working. So this is exactly happening. So the slave works with nature, So, but what about slave? You just see the story of this slave. It is different. It works with nature. See, the slave, for its mutual recognition, where shall it depend upon? See, its association is not with this master only because it wants to work. It goes out because it wants to produce something, it wants to labor, it wants to bring more and more products for the master. So it gets identifies with more and more products, gets more and more recognition from others. So the slave always, why I wanted to highlight this point is that because in one of my next slides I am bringing in Nietzsche and his morality. Okay. So it what this slave is doing. So it gets more associations. Now it gets a full herd. I mean, by her HERD, I mean a group. A group, of course, is with him. So in one way, the slave is becoming more powerful, isn't it? So we come to that. So master is enslaved by the labor of the slave. That is, I have put it like that. I think you got a point. See, in some way, the master is fully dependent on. So if I'm fully dependent on something else or somebody, the question arises, am I really free? Whereas see the slave, it enjoys more freedom because it has its ambience is very, very broad. Its recognition or its associations are very, very wide open. Okay. So kind of an asymmetric relationship. So the here now we have come as if the slave in fact enjoys more freedom. So we can say now the slave has won over the master in one way, we can say. So here Hegel says, see, when we explain it in terms of the socio-political context, we can say something like authority without responsibility or responsibility without authority. This is exactly happening in the political scene. So history comes to an end where there are no more masters and slaves. So with it, again, there may begin another triad, maybe with different people. So this is what Hegel says. And of course, Marx, this Lacan is beautifully highlighting this idea. If time permits, I will come to that. Okay, so master slave, Nietzsche explains it in terms of master slave morality. So whatever Hegel has described from the times of Hegel up to Foucault, as I should say, up to Michel Foucault, this master slave dialectic, it is something like a great paradigm, I should say, if I can use that word, for philosophers to depend upon. But when Foucault came, Foucault also takes up this, but he takes a critique of it. When we go more through the works of Foucault, that's what we can find. I will come to that if time permits. Okay. So Nietzsche, after reading this Hegelian concept, he applies it in the context of morality, because we know the very famous work of Nietzsche is Genealogy of Morals. So there is what he calls master morality, which is this strong, powerful, which emphasizes. Now you will understand it very easily. Of course, all of you know master slave dialectic and master slave morality, but still, because I like it, I'm explaining it more and more. Okay, sorry. So strong, powerful emphasizes excellence, strength, pride, weighs actions on good or bad consequences. So that is it. Emphasizes the use of fear on those who are below them. So the master morality is one. Which weighs actions as good or bad upon consequences. Okay, that is the master morality. So it's always the morality of the strong, the powerful, etc. Okay, whereas there is something else called slave morality, which is characterized by kindness, patience, generosity, equity, disregards hierarchy. There is always hierarchy in master morality. Then weighs actions on good or bad intentions. It's not that the consequences are taken for determining whether an action is good or bad, but the intention behind the action is that which counts as makes it good or bad. So in concerns with the justice. So these are all important elements in slave morality. Okay. I continue. So Nietzsche criticized the view that good is everything that is helpful and bad is harmful. Why Nietzsche made this particular statement that we have to think. Okay. So Nietzsche says, see, who said it is good? Who said good is that, or who said it is bad? It is for the noble class. That's what Nietzsche says. The noble men, the noble group decides what is good. And what is good is what is useful for them or helpful for them. And what is bad is what is harmful for them. It is in such a way that good and bad are being determined here. So that is what the real interpretation of good or bad. So that's why he says good or bad is the moral interpretations by the strong, the noble. Okay. So the essence of master morality is nobility. Master morality is the morality of the handful few. So if few people, the noble class, the powerful people on or who hold the power and the authority, who themselves considered to be noble, who judges action by themselves. So they are the creators of morality. And what about the others? Others who are huge in number, they are supposed to simply to obey that. Okay. So the slave morality is resentment, it's hostility. Because see, a few people say this is good and this is bad, and of course you are supposed to act like this or that. Something like a moral authoritarianism, isn't it? And we can find this kind of the further expositions of it in feminist morality, feminist ethics, I mean. Then it originates in the weak, which one? Slave morality, in the subversion. So essence of slave morality is in utility. The good is what is useful for the whole community. See, that is what that means for every human being, for the whole of humanity. That is what the slave morality always intends to. And in that way, an action is judged as good or bad. Okay. So here there is a contradiction. What is the contradiction? There is a powerful, the few. They are the proponents of master morality. But the slave morality, though it is represented as weak, they represent the whole masses. So in number, quantitatively speaking, the slave is more in number, we can say, because the whole masses represent slave morality. Now the weak gain power by corrupting the strong into believing that will to power are evil. So claim humility is voluntary. So what is being said here? So as we have seen in the case of master-slave dialectic, here also, first the master, of course, he makes certain moral commandments and he wants to see that the weak obeys it accordingly. So the weak say they are weak and they are humble, human, and they have humility and all that. So here I have put something like will to power. So it's a very key concept of Nietzsche, which you know. Because what does it say? See, there is one of the, I will come to the next slide and also, and then I will explain more. See, Nietzsche was, of course, we know, he was in fact writing something like Antichrist. He was a critic of Christianity, Christian religion. So biblical principles of humility, charity, and pity follow, universalizing the slave morality into all mankind. The democratic movement hired to Christianity. What does he mean here? See, we know one of the very powerful statements of Nietzsche, God is dead. See, why, rather than simply saying Nietzsche said God is dead, there comes the other question, why Nietzsche said God is dead? So that's more important. And Nietzsche says that there is the, who is a human being? There is the strong will in every human being. So what if he believes in God? Nietzsche says, if man believes in God, then he will never try to bring his will or his willpower or his inner power. because by nature, man is very, very inherently, there's a lot of power and freedom inside in man, but he will never try to manifest it or bring it outside, because he always wants to see that he will never be assertoric, and he will always want to see that everything he simply as if he lives to surrendering to God and suffering, something like that. And Christianity, of course, teaches that. That's what Nietzsche says. I'm not criticizing Christianity, but I'm just saying what Nietzsche said, of course, because all of us know Nietzsche is a critic of Christianity. So what happens in the society? So it recurs in history. That is, see, because this slaves are more in number. What happened in the course of Western history was, see, the slave people could somehow or other, they could convince the master that they are weak. It is by nature they are voluntarily they are being more, they have humility, etc., etc. So, and slowly the weak people or the those who are the slaves, they increase in number. So the win of the Christian slave morality, according to Nietzsche, it leads to the collective degeneration of man. Slave conquered master. Slowly, you can see slave conquering master. So was Nietzsche a champion of master morality? That is the question here. So I have put a yes or no question here. I can say a no. Why? But can it be an exactly a no? Or is there some sort of a yes from other side? Of course, okay. Who is Nietzsche? Nietzsche is one who's believed in the will to power, one who believed in the Superman. So he always wants to see in that is the real man. So Nietzsche can't tolerate this, something that is weak, something that is merely resentful or merely of the nature of humility. Of course, in that way, we can say that maybe Nietzsche was supporting master morality, but not exactly, we can say. So, what actually Nietzsche wanted to stress in his master slave morality, his entire purpose, I have put in the next sentence. That is, he wanted a kind of a transvaluation or a revaluation of moral values, by which he means an exaltation of life and not exaltation of suffering. What does Nietzsche mean by that? See, because see here, Nietzsche makes reference to one or two particular aspects. Sexuality is something which is considered as immoral or something which is not permissible. Why? Because the noble class always want to see that the slaves are making products and they're working and working and working. Okay. And so the master always wants to exploit the slave. And when we come to the social structure, it's something like exploitation of the class of slaves, we can say. And again, what about the Christian morality, the slave morality? Christian morality is slave morality, according to Nietzsche. So it always teaches suffering. See, why shall man waste life? Nietzsche's words. In resentment, in suffering. That is the question of Nietzsche. Let him be more free. Let him enjoy. Let him be in his exalted state of human existence or human being, and not simply suffering all the lives. So that is something wrong which Nietzsche could see in slave morality. So if there is a morality according to some kind of a new morality according to this Nietzsche, let me say, it's a kind of a morality where man lives an exalted state of a human, and maybe he's more free enough to have such a state of existence. And that is why maybe this master-slave morality influenced. See, we know genealogy. It was written in Genealogy of Morals. Further, this very question of genealogy is taken up by Foucault. And again, we can see and other people also interpreting Nietzsche in many, many ways. Okay, I'm not. Let me stop my presentation with 2 or 3 slides more. So yes. So I was trying to bring in a nutshell the philosophy of Hegel, especially his questions on freedom, self-consciousness, master-slave dialectic, and how Hegel could improve, or I can say, give a more comprehensive view of philosophy and maybe reason and all, and what all he took from Kant and how he could improve Kant, etc., etc. And now, there is the other part also, that is in retrospective and in the prospective angle also we have to see how Hegel influenced the 20th century philosophy. I'm not, that is not the very idea of my presentation, but simply I wanted, because I thought if I'm not adding 1 or 2 slides, it won't be complete. That's the only reason I have tried to make references here and there about Hegel and 20th century. So Hegel, in fact, presented a model of historical consciousness. That is really the original contribution of Hegel, I shall say, because he was very much influenced by Marx, the materialistic historical model with the concept of class struggle. Marx came up, we know. Then Hegel and Marx, both of them influenced French existentialism like anything. Then Simone de Beauvoir, she finds master-slave dialectic as the relation of power between man and woman. Then Hegelian recognition. So that is very, very important, because I think there comes the question of the other. And from there, we have intersubjective relationships, and the whole of post-structural thinking. I think the nuances of it ensues from there, I believe. So, and that's a theme for existentialism also, because there is something like in itself, for itself, and being for others also. Then Sartre reads master slave in the looks of the other. Okay, we know. And maybe afterwards, if you want, we can have further discussions upon that, because the look of the other in the Sartre is very, very interesting to read. So what exactly is happening when a person A looks at B? There Sartre explains it exactly in the line, along the lines of master-slave. So one who looks, he is the master, and one who is being subject to that look, is the slave. And why the other always wants to be like that, or does he wants to come away out of that? And how one realizes consciousness and freedom through that for itself arises, emerges out of that. Sartre explains it very beautifully. Okay, so but Sartre moves from social struggle to see what Marx presented as class struggle or social struggle. And if we see a Hegelian background also, we can see it's something like a social struggle in terms of certain group of people. And Sartre comes more to intersubjective relationships, we can say. Then Hegel and Foucault, of course, very, very important. So Foucault takes a critique of, so I think I have skipped one. Yes. Okay. Foucault takes a critique of master-slave dialectic, we can say. That is, for Hegel, human knowledge comes with the development of consciousness. But Foucault says the possibility of knowledge is articulated with the phenomenology of power. But what is power of Foucault, and what is history of Foucault? Because Foucault is using the term archaeology, but we know it's not the ordinary history, or because when Foucault uses the term archives, he just means the conditions of possibility in knowing and all that. So he says there are a lot of things. Maybe we can call it historical in the sense certain conditions which remain hidden, he says. In that sense, it is something like a historical and not in the exact sense of the term history, we can say. So Foucault says the possibility of knowledge articulated with the phenomenology of power. Then Hegel believed in the totalizing historical progression, because Hegel represents modern philosophy, but Foucault, being a postmodern and post-structural thinker, so he considers progress and power as a modern myth. So the way to freedom, Foucault says, conceals the subtle forms of unfreedom. So I'm not going to details of that. And Foucault's biopower, we know, is a new turn away from Hegelianism. So Hegel says truth is undermined by the power of the master, but Foucault says truth is on the side of the repressed and can be achieved only by fighting the ideology of the master. So, so in its representation of truth, there is difference between Hegelian conception and Foucauldian reading, because Foucault believes that truth is produced through the control and discipline of. So there comes the significance of biopower, both the master and slave. So here, because Foucault, we know he refers to human bodies. By body also, what it is. It's embodied existence, we can say. And something like docile bodies, we can say. So institutions, power, modern conceptions. So where it's not directed to a single person, but every human being or the whole mass of people. They are, say, at one point, Foucault even says that truth is something which is squeezed out of the bodies of the master and the bodies of people. So by people, he means, and it is where he explains some the so-called features or characteristics of modern institutionalization, power structures and all that, so I'm not going into that. And Lacan, highly influenced by master-slave dialectic. So in his Mirror Stage, he explains it very beautifully, because as I told you at the outset, because in Mirror Stage, what Lacan says, when a little child looks at the mirror, he says it's alter ego, he says it's other. And at first, of course, it is in a wonder, and and then again it wants why exactly someone like me. So that question arises. So it's something like an alter ego. It likes it, at the same time it dislikes it. Okay, something like that happens, and of course this conflict between the ego and the alter ego, because its mother tells it, see, you shall become like your father. Or you shall become like your mother, a great doctor or a great teacher. So something is instilled in that child, and the alter ego works there. So when it grows up, the question is whether what about its ego, or what about itself, whether it lives for itself or it is for the big other. So Lacan makes a difference between small other and big other. So there's a big question, we know, that's really happening in our cases also, because the child doesn't know whether it wants to live for itself or just want to simply satisfy the needs of desires of the other. So there's comes something like a conflict, and ultimately who is going to win? So something like a master-slave dialectic is going there. Then feminists, of course, take a mixed view, because Butler and all, they take a different opinion, but there are Dana Haraway and all, they of course support the Hegelian view of master-slave morality. I'm not going, because I have already told you that's not the intention of this presentation. So, but I'm just putting some remarks here and there, so that we can have further reading. So that's the end of my presentation, because I hear